Welcome to the last recorded lesson of the course this year. I'm going to take this time in 5 parts to give my own reflections on where we're headed and working in some of what we've covered in the course. Now, a caricatured way to end a course like this would be to spend the entire semester telling you all kinds of doom and gloom and then end with a few trite positive signs. That's not my intent. I've tried to present an empowering view all along in this course, and to emphasize that even the tough news about collective action problems should give us compassion for our plight and for each other. So I want to end the course with reminding you of 5 mental traps that are similar to the ones that I mentioned on the first day. The first of these is an overly strong focus on economic growth. Second is to let people figure out what's good for them. The third is the idea that humans suck. The fourth is this tension between environment and human welfare. And the fifth is a focus on an impending but not yet present disaster. So all of these 5 mental traps can be paralyzing in terms of policy and in terms of individual psychology. And that's because they lead to fear. And of course,
fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
So when people are afraid or threatened, they tend to think short term, they tend to think selfishly, they act defensively, and they innovate less and take fewer risks. So we instead want to get to a place where we have a positive vision of the future. And when people are happy and comfortable and they feel secure in what they're faced with in their future, they tend to be more outgoing, more bold, more farsighted, more pro-social, which makes that more positive future, helps to make that more positive future possible. So I want to go to a place where we share a positive vision for our future and in which we can impose strong environmental constraints on our behavior in the service of sustainability, yet in which life is always getting better. And so I will lean on that. I will lean on ideas from the lecture on happiness to convey that idea, and that's also the topic of the assigned reading for this week. So let's go through the 5 mental traps. The first one is an overly strong focus on economic growth. Now, you've all heard critiques of economic growth before as an implicit societal objective. I want to point out that some of those criticisms could well be applied even to one of the countervailing movements of degrowth. So just to remind you, if we slice data in certain ways, one of them here is to look across countries at a moment in time, we find that there's no decrease in life satisfaction with increasing income. So taking all things equal, wealthier people do tend on average to be happier. Yet, if we unpack those data in a bit more detail, if we include other measures than income to explain life satisfaction, we find they have independent and strong explanatory power. And I've shown you that that explanatory power is so strong, in particular when we're thinking about predicting changes over time, that we should have maybe the bulk of our focus on the social context and social relationships and social fabric of society in thinking about making for good lives in the future. Secondly, we've also discussed something called consumption externalities, by which, in addition to environmental externalities, and by that I mean that when everybody in a group or in a society starts being able to consume more, becomes wealthier, not everyone benefits the same as one would expect if one looks at a plot like this. And that is because our brains seem to be wired to take into account the standards set by others for certain kinds of material experiences, at least, in particular, conspicuous material consumption. So we have all this focus still in our public discourse, in our policy thinking, really in our culture about economic growth, growth. And I would like to advocate for us to stop talking about growth almost entirely. We have all of these new terms to make economic growth sound better: green growth, balanced growth, sustainable growth, inclusive growth. And then there's this other term, which has been coined by those who are advocating for doing the exact opposite, which is to actually shrink our economy. Now, there are some subtleties as to how we would measure that, but the way this term is usually interpreted, is the natural interpretation of this term, is that we should aim to reduce the size of the economy. And the reason for doing this is ostensibly, it's stated to be for environmental reasons. In other words, economic growth is so closely related to environmental destruction, to energy use, to resource use, that the only way to fix those problems is to reduce the size of economic activity. So I find that approach to be quite problematic, in particular the way I've stated it. Now, I'm going to tell you some reasons that I object to it. Okay, so I'm advocating, so this slide, this slide I think represents a voice that may be perpetuating the problem of our over-focus on economic growth, because it says, look, everybody who's focused on economic expansion as a way to make people better off, you're wrong. We actually need to still focus on growth, but we should be doing the opposite, to shrink the economy. Okay, so I want to advocate for relaxing the societal focus on the size of the economy in not one, but in two ways. So we should not be pursuing its expansion for its own sake. In other words, there's no particular reason to pursue economic growth, except insofar as it improves human lives. And we should be measuring the improvement of human lives separately, because it's not the same thing as economic growth. Nor should we be focusing on economic growth in hopes of limiting environmental destruction. The idea of degrowing the economy then, I think, has become a rhetorical trap, which, just like the mainstream emphasis on growth, tends to perpetuate a focus on GDP. So instead of seeing GDP as a panacea for conflict, for improving lives, for indeed raising people to a standard at which they may start to be able to care about the economy more, all of these reasons to focus on economic growth, instead of seeing economic growth as a villain, as a panacea, or indeed as a villain, we should address the goal of improving human well-being, which we can measure and which we have all kinds of insight now as to how to improve. And we should address the constraints, the imperatives, the environmental imperatives, by measuring those environmental outcomes more directly as well. So that really sums up as the claim that we should be measuring what matters. And economic growth is on neither side of this ledger. It's neither a goal that we should be pursuing, nor is it a reasonable measure of environmental harm. So my three critiques of degrowth is that, number one, it perpetuates this focus on growth, which is in some sense precisely what the degrowth community is trying to fix. So it's counterproductive in that sense. As I've just said, it's also not a good proxy for environmental damage. Now, in this discourse, in this debate, comes down to the question of decoupling. In other words, degrowth community will often say, well, show me evidence of environmental decoupling. In other words, where some measure, say, energy use or greenhouse gas emissions or some other material impact has not increased in tandem with economic growth. That would be decoupling. And my response is, of course we can decouple. Looking at history is all very well, but if we haven't been trying to decouple, if we have not been applying policies that we expect to decouple those things, it's not particularly interesting to watch in the past and see that they have always gone together, or often gone together. So we know very well how to implement paired policies where, for instance, we invest in efficiency in some field, let's say energy production, and let's, for instance, energy use. So for instance, the greenhouse gas intensity of our cars or of some other industry, and at the same time impose a cap or a decreasing cap on the actual environmental bad measured properly, so maybe greenhouse gas emissions from cars or from an industry. If we've imposed a cap, we know for sure that any increases in efficiency, any increases in the actual productivity of the output of the productivity of a sector will not be coupled to increases in the environmental harm because we've capped it, right? So if we have the tools to decouple any particular measurable environmental outcome from economic progress, from efficiency, from innovation. All we need to do is to actually put that into practice. By the way, if we had some reason to actually decrease the size of the economy, in other words, the economic value of consumption, which I'm telling you has nothing in principle to do with the material impact of consumption, but if we did want to increase the economic size of consumption, what we should really be doing is to start regulating or decreasing work hours. Remember that this is a bit of an aside now, but the size of the economy is not a sum of everything that we do with our lives. It's the part that's in the market. It's the part for which we earn market wages and buy market goods. And that's a fraction of our lives. It's a significant fraction. It's an important one. But we also do valuable things for our well-being in the other parts that economists just think of as leisure. But that's where we pursue our relationships and our recreation and our our self-development in many ways, and also things like good sleep and so on. So in any case, there's evidence that if you do start to try to restrict work hours, productivity doesn't go down, output doesn't even go down as much as you might expect, or even not at all. And that may well make room for some of the things that have been squeezed out of our life by the growing market component, and that might make us better off. But if you don't stop people from earning market income, i.e. Working wage jobs, then you're not going to be able to shrink the value of the economy very easily. Okay. Now that's an aside because I'm not advocating shrinking the value of the economy. What we need to do is to cap and decrease, shrink our material impacts. And those are things we can do by directly measuring and regulating those things, using caps, for instance, using price instruments, for instance, using regulations, for instance. And at the same time, we want to improve the productivity of let's say, green production, and also of anything else that which will improve human lives. So paired policies can absolutely decouple any particular form of economic growth from environmental harm. Certainly, that's a good generalization. And the third important reason to avoid this trap of degrowth is that it seems to me just a political non-starter, in the sense that if you're advocating degrowth, it sounds like a negative. It sounds like a decreasing level of welfare, even if that link is not very close one. And so it closes ears. And it's especially nonsense for developing countries. There's no way we want to cap developing countries at the current levels of market activity. What we want to do is to improve lives and constrain, eventually, as soon as possible, in a measured way, the material impacts that are supporting those good lives. Now, in many ways, the way to do that is by doing it more radically in the wealthier countries first, and producing technology to make those things easier, and also setting standards and social norms for wealthy lives. But there's no way that we want to go around telling people to cap their economic output. That's just a bizarre idea. And for reasons that we've discussed, it's very problematic to go around even telling people that we want to cap material impacts for developing countries at current levels. So there's a more subtlety needed in a development plan than that. Okay, so that's the first trap. And next, I will talk about the mental trap number 2. Let's talk about mental trap number 2, which is that we have this reliance on letting people figure out what's good for them. By this, in particular, I'm referring to the fact that economists are still generally focused on a world in which people are on average making decisions that are in their best interests. Now, economists are very reticent to ever get into a paternalistic role. We don't like to tell people, you should do this for your own sake. However, we've learned so much about what makes for a good life, what makes people happy, what makes people feel satisfied with their lives, that we don't need to get into a paternalistic role in order to really change how we think about our objective, and indeed to make people's lives better by essentially changing the circumstances and changing the education that we offer. So instead of, and this relates to the overemphasis on growth, of course, instead of pursuing growth, in other words, enhancing people's spending power as an implicit or explicit social policy goal, and instead of assuming that people will tend to make decisions that further our own long-term well-being, if we instead value human experience and we care about how life feels to people, let's do them the honor of discussing and teaching about which things promote well-being based on the science, based on the evidence. And let's stop confusing people about how to measure their own success by surrounding ourselves with information about the poor proxies, like how fast is our incomes rising, and by focusing overly on the consumption and income components in wealthy countries in particular, when there are social aspects in our jobs and in our lives which are much more valuable in terms of human well-being to put our attention on, to put our minds to bring science to. So there's a lot of innovation that's not in the production productivity realm, but just in our lives and our organizations, how we conduct our services and our work lives in a way to make lives better. So again, this is a matter of focusing on measuring what actually matters. And I've given you some examples. These are here all based now on empirical evidence. And it's really, I take joy in this, in the plots like this, right? Because in the last decades, we have learned enormous amounts about biology and genetics and epigenetics and development. And we have this incredible depth of knowledge about how complicated we are as biological entities, and indeed everything else around us. But we're also, the fact is that the way we've evolved, we're very simple in some ways. And the fact that we are designed with these ridiculously simplistic sources of pleasure, of eating good food and eating it with other people, of the touch and warmth of others, of sleep, of sex, of seeing colors and vistas that for some reason look good to us, of music, of our own movement, of dance. Those will never be taken away from us, no matter how smart we get as individuals or as a society. And this is such a gift. So this is one thing that it is a terrible waste if we don't properly recognize those in the way we face our education and the design of society. So just to remind you, we had a attempt maybe at a brief laughing therapy, but it turns out that by giving someone else a hug or by just standing tall for a moment and thinking empowering or compassionate thoughts about yourself and others, many other very quick interventions like this, you can improve your life. I mean, that's magic. I think it's phenomenal. So again, I think I've mentioned these organizations. This is one that is focused on these kind of small things to improve our own lives. This is one which is an absolutely brilliant organizer of policy evidence for organizations and governments about how to make lives better. What policies actually make lives better? And there are now all these international efforts to collect and disseminate evidence on how good life is across countries, how to measure it. Indeed, there's now an international happiness council. I was actually attended their meeting in 2017, took this picture. There are states with ministers of happiness. This is in the same place in Dubai. This is the UAE Minister of Happiness. We have these policy reports that really have, I think, transformative ideas for what we could be doing in health, in education, in urban policy, in governance, meaning actually how governments work. And there are governments around the world who are really taking this kind of thinking, a life satisfaction-based cost-benefit approach very seriously, or moving towards that, and at least thinking about the goal of society, of policy, more in terms of the human experience of well-being. Wales, New Zealand come to mind. New Zealand now has had 2 years of what they call the well-being budget. There are other countries in this list now, and in fact, Canada is one of them as well. The Canadian government is quietly right now working on a new framework for policy and budgeting that will be centered around human well-being. I've already given a lesson on happiness. I don't want to belabor this, but just to remind you how different some things could be if we took this lens to policy. And we know now that loneliness has the same impact on survival as smoking. Right? How have we been overlooking this? So this is taken from the Global Happiness and Wellbeing Policy Reports. And there's a chapter on health policy. And if you just take a life satisfaction approach to the way we deliver health and the way we think about public health as well, you realize that we should be putting focus on not just patients, but carers and family and their actual well-being outcomes rather than old-fashioned measures of how sick or how properly performative somebody's body is. It means almost inevitably that we will be putting much greater emphasis on mental health in all dimensions of life. We will probably rethink, this is very salient in the context of COVID-19, we think about end-of-life care with more of a well-being focus rather than a longevity fascination with longevity. And there's this enormous scope for social and emotional learning to improve lives and health outcomes. And I've already mentioned this as well, but these skills like compassion and resilience and mindfulness and leadership and relationship building skills, they all require training and practice just like physical activities do and just like our cognitive training in school does. So if you look at the curricula that are based on well-being that have now been rolled out in a number of places, this is an example of a number of topics that are that have now significant evidence in how they promote well-being. And by the way, here's another list of positive education interventions that all have published validations now. And there's no conflict here between learning about this stuff in school and in high school and in university and in graduate school and through ongoing learning throughout the life course in one's working years, and indeed one's retirement. These are all things where we can actually, it's low-hanging fruit essentially to make lives better. And there's no conflict between these things and learning the cognitive skills. In fact, when students have some of these non-cognitive skills in their pocket, they end up doing better at learning the reading, writing, and the arithmetic. So, okay, so that's just a glimpse, a reminder that some of these things are making their way increasingly into curricula, but there's still huge scope for improving lives around the world. Probably even more so in developing countries than some developed countries, based on how education systems work. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about this assumption that people are just going to do what's best for them if we let them be. Of course, society directs us and informs us in many ways about what is likely to make life better. And those are not necessarily correct. They're not necessarily unbiased. They may be market-oriented. They may even be, if you remember the dark side of capitalism, they may in fact be explicitly biased just in order to make somebody else be able to profit off our misdirection. Okay, so let me stop this component there, and I'm going to talk next about mental trap number 3. Let's talk about mental trap number 3. And this is the idea, or this is a resentment against humans, against society, against your neighbors, against even yourself. I'm hoping that at least the Canadians, most of you know who this is. This is David Suzuki, a lifelong science broadcaster and environmentalist. He's spent much of his career trying to educate people about the natural world and various environmental issues and to promote better individual behavior. And for those who've met David off camera, you might know that he's a little frustrated at this point. You might say the same thing of other Canadians like Bill Rees, Farley Mowat also. But this kind of pessimism about humanity, I've tried to convey to you in this course reasons to fight that feeling, right? So these messages that people are screwing up collectively, we're bad or stupid, I want you to replace those messages with compassion for what we are facing, which is intrinsically difficult collective action problems. I mean, there are other species which have overcome collective action problems. So for instance, the fact that a pack of wolves cooperate to hunt a bison is evidence of collective action problem. But they've done it by evolving to be deeply pro-social in their nature, which, by the way, we've also done. But among all the other species, probably only we can conceive of and understand new collective action problems which present themselves and devise solutions. But it's hard because collective action problems are the ones that that require sometimes enforcement mechanisms that we don't have available. So one of the things that I want you to come away with from this course is it's really hard to get one's head around, even after coming through this course, even after teaching it, and that is, it's possible for there to be a better world for all of us. And as this cartoon shows, right, our world is going to have all of these things. It's going to have a disaggregated energy production system, which is good for all kinds of reasons. We're going to have preserved rainforests, have green jobs, livable cities, clean water and air, healthy children. We're going to get there. In particular, we have all the technology collectively to get there quite quickly. So it's possible for that better world to be within reach collectively, and yet for us not to be able to attain it because we don't have a way to enforce collective action. And that is actually, I find that still profound, um, and subtle, and it's really hard to properly internalize. I think that concept of the big prisoner's dilemma, a collective action problem, what Professor Badami calls social traps. It makes sense. It's a real feature of the world that this better future is there, but we may not be able to access it because we don't have, say, a world government with the ability to enforce rules. If we did have such a thing, if it was feasible to have those enforcement mechanisms, we would all agree we want to go there, right? We would all enforce the rules, but without that ability to enforce rules, it's very difficult to get there. So that, to me, takes off a lot of the moral judgment and pressure of the situation, because everybody wants that better world, but we don't necessarily have a way to access it. So I want you also to remember about collective action problems that although they're problems, they always represent opportunities. So remember that collective action problems can both be bad things that are happening that you could avoid, but also the potential of bettering everybody, which is difficult to get to. I mean, these are the same thing, but technological development and production of music, these are collective action problems. These are opportunities. So remember that collective action problems define society. Our successes, our greatest successes, are in overcoming them. And have compassion for the fact that they're hard to get to, and for the fact that the solution, ultimately, often, part of the solution to solving them comes in something called leadership. And that's something that we can all participate in. Let's celebrate the ones that we solve, and let's celebrate our efforts to solve the tough ones, and let's celebrate partially solving them. So solving collective action problems, it's what we do as humans, as society. And I gain great joy in doing that, in celebrating all of the amazing things that we have done, in which we have had to collectively bring resources together to a very surprising degree to accomplish things that no individual and no small group could possibly do. I mean, putting an incredibly complex spacecraft on another planet, building an international collaborative residence in orbit around the Earth, and keeping it staffed from several countries through all kinds of conflict that's going on down below. Every bit of preservation and conservation that we've managed, more land and ocean is conserved today than ever before. Actually, Antarctica, where I've spent time on a couple of occasions, is another example of a place where we have a somewhat magical international cooperation that is a bit divorced from conflicts in the rest of the world. But the oceans around Antarctica are, in principle, a huge ecological zone, and a place that's supposed to be safe from various commercial exploitation and conflict. Indeed, even our meetings, our efforts in relation to climate change represent humans coming together and doing their best to look after others. It's hard, we don't have those enforcement mechanisms, but the humans are coming to these meetings with the same good intentions, and it's natural to us, even in the face of tough odds, to want to do the best to look after each other. The Sustainable Development Goals also really represent our amazing collective aspirations, despite all their flaws. And just to remind you some of this low-hanging fruit that I mentioned in relation to improving education and shifting policy towards improving human well-being, it's not the case that the low-hanging fruit is just for the wealthy world. In developing countries, trust tends to be lower, social fabric is weaker. Probably in most places, knowledge of the non-cognitive skills that I mentioned is less emphasized in schools. And so thinking about human well-being is important at all levels of development. It represents low-hanging fruit to make lives better everywhere. It's worth celebrating that in spite of all of the downsides, we've talked about a number of the challenges that are going on. For 25 years, extreme poverty has been in steady decline around the world. Actually, unfortunately, that's ended in 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic. And it's also under threat by climate change. But it's certainly within our means to eliminate poverty. One of my favorite ideas that comes out of the Sustainable Development Goals, which everybody agrees are quite flawed, but this quote actually from a colleague inspires me, and it's that in terms of sustainable development, all countries are now developing countries. Right? It's shifted. The Sustainable Development Goals shift the measures of success from traditional ones, which overly emphasize economic output, to all these measures of sustainability that nobody is doing well at. We're all developing now in that sense. Indeed, if you were to order countries by level of development, the richest ones might be doing the worst in some cases. Another thing that I celebrate is humans, I've mentioned, have very strong identities. They're very important to our self-conception, and our social identities are very important to how we see ourselves and how we behave. And I think that an amazing new phenomenon from this century is the existence of a global social identity. People can actually identify with, hey, I'm a human, and this is something I have in common with everyone around the world, and this is a salient identity. We have collective foes. We have collective outsiders to humanity. I also, I'm on just telling you some things that make me happy about the world, I guess. I get endless joy out of some of our accomplishments like this. I think Wikipedia is really one of the marvels of our species. It is such an emblem of people coming together to generate a public good that benefits everybody all around the world. There are analogs to the information, the open information that Wikipedia represents, in fact, in open source hardware. So there's an idea to build up essentially a set of blueprints that are non-proprietary, that would help somebody from scratch build up all the machinery you need to start farming with relatively modern methods, and indeed to build up other industrial processes and all of civilization. I love that idea. 3D printing is part of making that possible, in fact, and it's really an incredibly democratizing prospect for technology and for production. We have these, the future of one future trajectory for libraries is going to be places where you can come together and use tools and make things that are possible now to make in a decentralized way, just by sharing tools. So there'll be a lot more custom production. The link between our consumption wants and needs and producing them is going to shrink because of the availability of open source blueprints of various kinds, and and technology which allows us to make at least a good subset of stuff in one-off, in a custom manner. Now, can't help mention here also there's an extraordinary wealth of common knowledge from humanity in software realm as well. Everything that's running, the majority, I think, of mobile phones are running Android, which is actually almost all in open source. This is something which no one will ever be able to take away. Now, it's not necessarily decentralizing that particular market, but the open source world, it runs almost all of the world's servers. It's the brains behind all of the big IT companies are running Linux servers in the back end. There are all kinds of other accomplishments that show that we're actually making large changes, that there's traction in our direction, even if we're too slow. We know we're going to be too slow to meet some of our grand sustainability challenges, but the fact that we're doing it, brings hope and also compassion for humankind. So it's back in 2016 when renewables started to surpass coal, and now all fossil fuels together in terms of new installed capacity. That's not the same as production, but it'll come. And I've told you that Canada is one of the countries, among many actually, that have the ability to fully meet our net energy needs through renewables. We see policies of people actually undoing roads. So Vancouver has removed some highways. This is a wonderful direction for urban growth and development, to really reconceive how we get around and what makes for a good city. It's quite an undertaking to actually tear down significant highways. After years of campaigning, many of your colleagues here at McGill have, over the last 5-10 years, I shouldn't say not many of your colleagues, there has been a strong group advocating for divestment. And that divestment movement has really broken through, I think, a tipping point, so that you see an awful lot of the global investment funds and increasing number of banks and countries pledging to remove fossil fuels from their investments. This is something which just a few years ago really seemed very far off. Another example, also now a few years old, of what it takes to actually enforce shifts, to send signals to everybody. This is the direction that we're going to go. Get used to it, adapt, invest appropriately. Vancouver has banned all new natural gas in new buildings starting in 2030, and there's a transition towards that. This company is often in the news nowadays. More generally, the list of countries and cities that have now announced, and car companies that have now announced the end of any production of fossil fuel cars, has gone in not very many years from a distant target to something that's not only in our relatively near-term future, but in fact is moving up in time. These targets are getting more aggressive at the same time as they expand in adoption. You can go and look on Wikipedia for the list of countries here that have stated bans on the sale of new internal combustion vehicles coming up. Some of these are just cars, but some of them are cars and trucks. And some of them are all vehicles, including long transport trucks. And the list for cities is even longer and growing. In fact, Professor Badami has talked about the complications with biofuels. But what's happened in the meantime in recent years is that electric vehicles have become more feasible and efficient than anyone really predicted. And so much more exciting to me than the electric cars, of which I'm a fan and I have one and I love it. But the non-car vehicles are of course more in line with the kind of urban policies that we've described that are positive for urban development and efficient. This is an electric bus, and I saw the first electric bus in Montreal in November of 2020. these will be transforming our bus fleets. This bus has enough capacity for 2 days of normal school bus runs in one charge. So, and it's also made in Quebec. This is the Lion Electric. Even maybe more as transformative, again, it's not the cars. What's happening is that the electric bike industry has absolutely exploded in volume and in diversity. And you can now get cargo bikes and bikes of all styles. I think this could really transform how a lot of us get around. And we need to start putting street level bike parking or bike garages into the requirements, into the zoning rules for all new construction. So that instead of talking about how many parking spaces need to be associated with new construction, maybe we can be putting street level bike parking or mini enclosed parking containers where we currently park cars on the street, or enforce that they be in the bottom floor of new buildings and so on. The technology here, again, is just moving by leaps and bounds. In addition, a lot of our technology coming up is going to be from new directions that we aren't yet expecting, or that are not yet prominent, I should say. So this is a bacterium which is essentially lives off, it eats carbon dioxide, you could say. So it fixes carbon in a way that previously in biology, plants had that's what makes plants special. And so we are now genetically engineering bacteria to do this, which could really transform how we make biofuels or fix and sequester carbon. So for decades, some of us have been saying, look, we have all the technological solutions to climate change already. We don't actually need new technology. The changes, the technology is in hand. The problems lie in the social science. The problems lie in policy. The fact that there's these collective action problems that are needed to put that policy into place and substitute our investments towards it. And that's all true. That's been true for decades. On the other hand, in the meantime, while we haven't been solving the social science problems, we have been stalling and dragging our feet in some sense in the policy realm. Technology has been moving forward. And so what's happened is that the technology is moving so fast that some of the good changes that we need are inevitable regardless of policy. Right? So we have amazing innovations moving along like this, led by the vision of individuals in many cases. This is one you may remember, is taking carbon dioxide out of thin air. Okay, so that's all on the theme of celebrating collective action problems, for bringing opportunities, and recognizing they're difficult. And so celebrating our humanity and having compassion for humanity, for doing as well as we are. And now I'll move on to the fourth mental trap. The fourth mental trap is about the paralysis that we end up with when we think about a conflict between doing good and doing well, between looking after the environment and looking after human well-being, between looking after future people and looking after ourselves. Let me just mention a few tipping points that are kind of different in nature, but highlight the fact that it can be very difficult to see that bringing in environmental constraints doesn't necessarily make life worse at all. Coal has gone from something that used to be considered the absolute cheapest energy possible. No matter what happens with oil or with tight oil or even with natural gas, coal was thought to be always below any possible other energy price. It's plentiful, we'll never run out of it, and so on. And just now, just in the space of the last few years, it's gone from, it's become more expensive than renewable energy. Those prices have fallen so far that all of a sudden countries are, various jurisdictions are just essentially banning new coal power And even when that's not happening, it's just no longer being built by the market. And indeed, coal plants are being closed in many cases. And so, we have now a nationwide phase out of coal-fired power, existing power, which is supposed to happen this decade. And as we've discussed, the economics alone make this essentially a global shift. That's once that tipping point has been passed, we'll never go back. Carbon pricing used to be, still is in some places, such a divisive topic. But you have to look what happens where it gets implemented. Now, given the fact, I've mentioned that the prices we have now almost everywhere are maybe 5 or 10 times too small still. But it's interesting to note. So, in British Columbia, carbon pricing was incredibly contentious when it was first brought in. An election was fought over it. And the legislation was eventually passed. But in a recent poll, only 45% of British Columbians were even sure that they still have a carbon price. So that means this thing which is at the forefront, people are terribly afraid of how it's going to ruin their lives, largely due to irresponsible rhetoric from the detractors of the policy. We adjust just the same way we adjusted to having universal health care in Canada, for instance, which was revolutionary in its time and inspired a lot of fear for the economy. But British Columbia economically has done better than anywhere else during the time it's had its tax in place. So again, these things will become part of what we expect a normal and sane society to have in place as solutions to collective action problems. Another thing I think is important to realize is that legislation, government change, regulation does not happen overnight. It's incredibly complicated to come up with planning regulations, with building regulations. And so again, in British Columbia, it took them a decade to write a new set of building codes, which they finished in 2017 to achieve this net zero energy of new buildings by 2030, which I mentioned. So, but who celebrated all that work? There's an enormous amount of opportunities of good that needs to be done. Once we have a positive vision of the future, there's just a lot of work to do. That's not instantaneous and not necessarily glorious, but once we do it, it will just be accepted as sensible, and it will be transformative. So the reading that I've asked you to do is, in fact, my own writing. I was initially for the Great Transition Initiative. And the basic message of mine is, or the policy framework that I advocate is to make policies that are designed and accountable to human well-being, properly measured. But that policy should be subject to a series of constraints on our material inputs and waste streams and land use change, say, so that we can control the impact on our natural systems and have a sensible, compelling, relevant goal within those constraints. And because of what we've learned about human well-being, my claim is that we can generally do all of that. We can impose all of these necessary ecological constraints while improving life. So this is a non-threatening vision of the future, and I think this is the way to provide political feasibility for imposing constraints. It avoids these emotions of guilt and fear and threatening our identities as good people, as good citizens, as environmental advocates, by simply taking away the options that cause conflict and celebrating the well-being improvement that we can do through good policy. There's actually one other important reason or concept to know that is related to this idea that imposing material constraints on society, or indeed imposing environmental regulation and constraints in general, or even prices, there's this idea called the Porter hypothesis, which is that in general, markets are so responsive, people are so innovative, that most of the constraints that we would ever want to impose will simply lead to new innovation. And because that novelty, the opportunity for transition, for displacement, for renewal can be so valuable in increasing efficiency, that often that innovation, the increased efficiency can more than offset the cost of the threat, the cost of the constraint. And so this is idea that actually putting constraints on imposing environmental constraints or scarcity leads to innovation. And in fact, we talked about that at the very beginning of the course in the cycle of resources, what constitutes a resource. When something becomes scarce, we just innovate our way out of it. And lo and behold, a few years later, we don't even miss the thing that was constrained away. So this innovation can lead to enough increase in efficiency as to overcome the cost of the imposed scarcity. That's the Porter hypothesis. And lastly, let me talk next about the apocalypse fetish. Okay, the fifth mental trap is a preoccupation with a coming apocalypse. Actually, let me start by explaining the most extreme version of this. And it's a preoccupation with end days. So it's the idea that as a result of some war in the Middle East or some sudden environmental catastrophe, the end of the world will come, and those who have been living the right way are going to rise up to heaven. So I call this an apocalypse fetish. But there's a maybe more environmentalist version of that, which is not much better. And that is to do with the idea somehow that the earth will cleanse itself. And so that could mean that as a result of a sudden emergency to do with the environment or climate change, either humanity will finally come to its senses once it gets to a certain point, will finally realize how important, how urgent this is, but we need to get to this catastrophe in order for that realization to happen, or that catastrophe will actually wipe out a large fraction of the human population, and that is somehow going to be good for the planet and represents the Earth cleansing itself. Or in an even more extreme and misguided way, you could see how this is related to this earlier, the other mental trap of a lack of compassion for humanity. But some people, some environmentalists will go so far, hopefully nobody in this audience, as to think that the solution to the planet's problems is to get rid of humanity. And that as and if the environment or our sustainability challenges get bad enough, we're going to hit some kind of an apocalypse which will rid the planet of our species. I'm going to respond to these misguided views very bluntly. On two counts. First of all, let me tell you that for the latter group of beliefs, indeed, for anybody who thinks that we are facing an existential threat in climate change or other sustainability challenges, let me tell you that is complete BS. There is no chance of humanity going extinct as a result of these challenges that we're facing. There are things that could lead to our extinction, like a meteorite impact. But our sustainability challenges are not going to rid the planet of humanity. It's simply not possible. That's not in the cards. So if that's part of anyone's thinking about how we get out of our problems, that they need to get worse in order to get there, that's delusional. Secondly, for those who think that there's some kind of threshold of catastrophe that we need to reach before people come to their senses, I want you to take a minute and look out the window, open a newspaper, look around. That world that you're seeing, that is what a climate crisis looks like. That is what it looks like to be living in a environmental catastrophe. Bangladesh is already flooding. The boreal forest is already burning. Millions of people are already being displaced by climate change. There's nothing that's going to get qualitatively worse. Everything bad is already happening. There are some quantitative changes which may still get worse. But this is what living in an emergency looks like. And so notice that all of the things in life that feel normal or enjoyable are happening in the middle of an environmental crisis. I think that's really important to recognize in order to focus on positive visions of the future and get away from any idea that there could be a constructive component to things getting worse. That is, of course, one of the mental traps that leads to inaction and paralysis. Let me, on this topic of the main topic of this lesson, which is having a positive vision of the future, let me say one more thing, which I think I mentioned earlier about policy, that governments often typically do a lot of forecasting of future needs. So what is it that I need to invest in? What policies do I need to put in place in order to be ready for what's coming in 5 years or 10 years? So governments do a lot of forecasting of those future needs based on current trends. And that's sometimes appropriate, but sometimes it may make for self-fulfilling prophecies, or it may perpetuate current beliefs about current trends themselves, or current beliefs and norms and assumptions about what future we're heading towards. So another paradigm, and actually this applies to organizations and businesses and indeed personal lives as well as governments, is to have goals that are driven by visions for a more or less distant future time, and then to work backwards to figure out what needs to be done now and along the path in order to get there. And so that's called backcasting in contrast to forecasting. So we will do a little bit of a visioning exercise in class. Now, I just want to wrap up this lesson and the course with a few thoughts, a few takeaways that I hope you've gleaned from the course and some of my own reflections. So by understanding that we are already in the worst part of a crisis or a set of crises, crisis of equality, crisis of climate, crisis of ecosystem loss, we are already in the middle of a great extinction event. By understanding that we're already in the middle of these crises, in a qualitative sense at least, and for all the reasons and challenges that we've covered in this course, and understanding that collective action problems are supposed to be nearly impossibly difficult, at least the global ones are, and that struggling in face of those odds to solve them anyway, and partly succeeding, that is humanity's genius. Solving collective action problems is what we do. It's what defines and strengthens societies. So by understanding these things, I hope you can appreciate all the things in life, all the things that we love in life are still going to be here in the future. So whether for you that's beautiful places or social experiences, teamwork, joint endeavors, for me, there's actually nothing better more satisfying individually or more beautiful socially than people coming together for collective problem solving. So in countless ways, the world now is better than it has ever been. It's true many things are likely to change, both good and some bad, in our lifetimes. This will be an interesting century. But that just means life is full of opportunity to make improvements in whatever trajectory is coming at us. And from that, I gain comfort. Personally, this is personal now, I also gain comfort from how endlessly beautiful the natural world is. Again, that's not going away. Even as things change, the cycle of life, the cycle of seasons, the landscape, wildlife, the complexity and unity of it all, being and moving outdoors, all those things I know are always going to take my breath away with their beauty. They're not going away. The natural world is, in many, many ways, very robust. The human world has been, in many, many ways, only darker in its past than it is now, when knowledge, rights, and justice are pervasive and there's a growing and necessary sense of global unity that is like the coming of age for our species. So with that, I just want to end and thank you for all of your excellent questions and hard work this term in what is likely the most trying times we'll ever see. It's been an honor for me to share, along with Professor Badami, this material with you.